Greetings, I'm Cleopatra, and I'm eager to unveil my tale to you. I was born in Alexandria, Egypt in 69 BC. I belong to the Macedonian Ptolemy dynasty of Egypt, established by Ptolemy I after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. After Alexander's demise, his vast empire was divided among his leading generals, including Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty, ruling over Egypt, maintained ties with Greek culture while embracing Egyptian traditions. This cultural blend was evident in the construction of temples dedicated to the Egyptian god Isis, the magnificent library of Alexandria, and the renowned lighthouse that made the city a significant cultural and trading center in the ancient world. In our dynasty, the name Cleopatra was commonly given to female members, just as Ptolemy was given to males. It was not uncommon for siblings to marry each other, a practice intended to preserve the purity of our bloodline. As I grew up in the royal palace of Alexandria, I received a thorough education in the prominent languages of the ancient Mediterranean, such as Greek, Egyptian, and Latin. Considering my later actions in life, one can assume that I was an intelligent young woman. My probable father, Ptolemy XX, ascended to the throne in 80 BC after his predecessor, Ptolemy XI, was lynched by a mob for murdering his wife, Berenice II, the last surviving daughter of Ptolemy IX. This event left only two illegitimate sons of Ptolemy IX as the descendants of Ptolemy I, the founder of our dynasty. At that time, the two brothers were in exile in the kingdom of Pontus. My father, Ptolemy XX, the elder of the two brothers, assumed the Egyptian throne, while the younger took the throne of Cyprus. However, Ptolemy the alone had left Egypt to the Roman Republic in his will, which prompted Ptolemy XX to seek Roman support in securing his rule. Through bribes to Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, he succeeded in obtaining the backing of Rome, forming an alliance between the Roman Republic and Egypt. Although this alliance temporarily secured my father's rule, it relied heavily on Roman support. Sadly, this newfound security was short-lived when Rome invaded Cyprus in 58 BC. My father's brother, Ptolemy of Cyprus, committed suicide, leading to riots in Egypt due to my father's failure to aid his brother against Rome. As a result, he was dethroned and fled to Rome Cleopatra V and her sister wife Berenice IV to assume joint rule over Egypt. Upon their arrival in Rome, my father, Ptolemy XII, likely brought me along. He attempted, but failed, to bribe the Senate into helping him regain control of Egypt. However, with the assistance of bribes, he eventually secured the support of an army under the proconsul of Syria, Aureus Gabinus, to invade Egypt. In 55 BC, the kingdom fell, and Ptolemy XII executed his daughter, Berenice, reclaiming the throne. Nevertheless, his bribes to Rome left Egypt in significant financial distress and solidified its status as a client kingdom of the Roman Republic. Reportedly, I accompanied my father and the Roman army into Egypt, where I encountered a young cavalry general named Mark Antony, or Marcus Antonius in Latin. Antony later professed that he fell in love with me during the campaign to invade Egypt. In 51 BC, my father, Ptolemy XX, passed away, leaving both me and my younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as joint rulers of Egypt. My father's decision to pass the throne to both of us indicated his expectation for me to marry my brother. However, from the beginning of my reign, I demonstrated that I had no intention of submitting to my brother and future husband. I ruled Egypt according to my own will, paying little regard to my brother as the co-monarch. It remains unclear whether Ptolemy XIV and I ever married, but our separate actions from the start of our reigns suggest otherwise. Nevertheless, as was the tradition in the Ptolemaic dynasty, where siblings often wed, the opposite may also be true. As the new queen, I endeavoured to secure my position by gaining the support of my subjects. Shortly after assuming the throne, I embarked on a journey up the River Nile to participate in a ceremony honouring the sacred bull Bushes. This ceremony involved catching and worshipping a wild bull as an incarnation of the falcon-headed war god Montu. Respecting Egypt's long-held religious traditions, I also tackled the practical issues plaguing the land at the time, such as the critical shortage of grain. Throughout history, Egypt relied heavily on the annual flooding of the River Nile, typically occurring in August, for its food supply. This flooding was dependent on the monsoon rains in the Ethiopian hills to the south, which would eventually flow downstream and flood the Nile River Valley, allowing crops to flourish. However, when I ascended to the throne, the flood had been unusually low. To address this problem, I implemented measures such as restricting the movement of grain and stockpiling it in major cities like Alexandria for distribution among the poor. By showing concern for the welfare of my people and actively participating in religious ceremonies, I aimed to win their hearts and minds, solidify my power base, and perhaps undermine support for my brother. Notably, the news of Ptolemy XI's death was deliberately delayed in reaching Egypt's overlords in Rome, likely to prevent interference for as long as possible. During this time, my brother grew increasingly resistant to my rule as I asserted my influence over the kingdom. I had rejected him as a potential husband and saw him as a rival, which eventually led to a conflict between us. Meanwhile, significant events were unfolding in Rome that would drastically change not only my life but also the course of European history. Gaius Julius Caesar, who became consul of the Roman Republic in 59 BC, found himself burdened by heavy personal debts. To resolve this issue, he sought a governorship with the help of his allies in the Roman Senate, including Marcus Licinius Crassus and Pompey the Great, who happened to be married to Caesar's daughter, Julia. These three influential figures, seeking to maintain stability and avoid conflict, formed a political alliance known as the First Triumvirate. Caesar, appointed as the governor of northern Italy, Eastern Europe, and southern France, embarked on a series of successful military campaigns in Gaul from 58 BC. His victories and growing popularity among the Roman population heightened the Senate's and Pompey's suspicions of his ambitious intentions. When Pompey's wife Julia died in childbirth in 54 BCE, Caesar lost the security provided by his alliance with Pompey. Additionally, Crassus was killed in an attack on Parthia in the east in 53 BC, leaving Pompey and Caesar as the two most powerful men in the Roman Republic. The Senate and Pompey demanded that Caesar disband his 4 legions in the north and return to Rome. Fearing the consequences that his enemies in the Senate might unleash upon him, Caesar refused their demands. In 49 BC, he made a bold move by crossing the river Rubicon in central northern Italy, advancing towards the capital. This act, bringing an army into Rome, was considered treasonous by the Senate, prompting Pompey and the senators to flee the capital with Caesar and his army in pursuit. The senators, along with Pompey the Great, had gathered their forces in Greece, aiming to regain power. However, I crossed the Adriatic Sea with my army and defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus on 9 August 48 BC. At the same time, tensions were escalating in Egypt, as Ptolemy XIV and his regent Pothinus took control of Alexandria and forced me to flee to Syria. Swiftly, I raised an army and returned to Egypt, determined to fight for my throne. Meanwhile, Pompey, who had survived the Battle of Pharsalus, fled from Greece and sailed across the Mediterranean, eventually arriving offshore in Egypt. He sent envoys to Ptolemy XV seeking refuge. Ptolemy's advisors, including Pothinus, debated the best course of action, realizing that Caesar would inevitably follow. They understood that allowing Pompey to go free or granting him sanctuary would risk angering or alienating Caesar. Ultimately, they decided to murder Pompey, and on 28 September 48 BC, he was stabbed to death as he came ashore. A few days later, Caesar arrived and upon being presented with Pompey's severed head, turned away in disgust. This event marked a significant turning point in the power struggle between Ptolemy XIV and myself. Caesar still held great respect for Pompey, despite his demise working to Caesar's advantage. He ordered both Ptolemy XIII and myself to disband our armies and negotiate a peace agreement. Additionally, Caesar demanded that Egypt repay a portion of its debts to Rome, which Ptolemy XIV vehemently refused to pay, further damaging his standing in Caesar's eyes. Caesar needed a dependable ruler in Egypt who would be willing to pay at least some of the money he desperately required. He intervened to broker peace between me and Ptolemy XVI. To win over the hostile Egyptian populace, Caesar declared that our younger brother and sister, Ptolemy XIV and Arsinoe XIV and Arsinoe IV, would be appointed rulers of Cyprus, a territory Rome had annexed a decade earlier. Consequently, I was summoned to negotiate an agreement with my brother. However, I initially sought to meet Caesar alone, having heard rumors about his desires. I resolved to have a one-on-one meeting with him, hoping to gain an advantage over my brother. Leaving my army in the desert, I was smuggled into Alexandria via the harbour in a bed sack with the help of one of my servants. Somehow my servant managed to navigate the streets, the royal palace, and Caesar's legionary guards, finally bringing me into his bedchamber. The first meeting between me and Julius Caesar, though lacking the mythical or romantic status attributed to it today, must have been the most crucial moment in my life thus far. The pressure and nerves I felt were unimaginable, as failure to impress the most powerful man in the world would have likely resulted in certain death. Contrary to the sexual or seductive image associated with Cleopatra, there is little evidence or contemporary accounts regarding my appearance. Roman historian Cassius Dio noted that I was striking to behold, while Greek historian Plutarch, writing a century before Dio, mentioned that my beauty was not incomparable and did not captivate all who saw me. Regardless of the debates surrounding my physical appearance, it is clear that my intelligence, courage, and charm captivated and won over the most influential men of the time. It was the power of my mind, not my body, that enchanted them. Shortly after our initial meeting, Julius Caesar and I became lovers. When my brother Ptolemy XIII learned of my relationship with Caesar, he spread the news throughout the city, causing riots. Caesar was irritated by this, and he took the opportunity to confront Ptolemy before the assembly of the city. He presented a copy of our father's will, in which he had bequeathed Egypt to both of us. With Ptolemy XIV now effectively under Caesar's control, his regent Pothinus devised a plan to defeat both Caesar and me. He ordered Ptolemy XIV's army of 20,000 to attack and lay siege to the royal palace, where Ptolemy XIV was held captive. A fire broke out in the harbour, possibly instigated by Caesar, which spread to the Great Library, resulting in the loss of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. My younger sister, Arsinoe IV, managed to escape the city and joined the besieging forces. She assumed command of the army and declared herself the Queen of Egypt. Meanwhile, Caesar, facing a desperate shortage of water supplies, attempted to seize control of the harbour by taking the island of Pharaoh, where the magnificent lighthouse stood. However, he was repelled and had to swim to a Roman ship for safety. The commanders of Arsinoe's army grew discontented and initiated negotiations with Caesar for the exchange of Ptolemy Exiv and Arsinoe. Ptolemy XIV was released, but he immediately resumed command of the Egyptian forces and continued the siege. Caesar had called for reinforcements when the siege began, and a Roman army arrived in the Nile Delta in early 47 BC. Caesar left the palace to lead the troops. The armies of Ptolemy, Exiv and Caesar clashed in the Battle of the Nile, resulting in a decisive victory for the Roman forces. During the battle, Ptolemy XIV's boat capsized, and he drowned. Caesar declared me the Queen of Egypt alongside my young brother, Ptolemy XIV. In the following months, both Caesar and I indulged in a lavish cruise along the River Nile on my pleasure barge. It was during this time that I was visibly pregnant with Caesar's child. In the spring of 47 BC, Caesar departed Egypt for Rome, likely due to reports of trouble on the Republic's eastern border with Pontus. There may have been political motivations for his departure as well, as my pregnancy and the birth of his son could have been used against him by his enemies in the Senate. After Caesar left, I gave birth to our son, who we named Caesarion or Little Caesar, in June of 47 BC. I publicly proclaimed Caesar as the father, while accounts suggest that Caesar, back in Rome, denied his paternity. A year later, I travelled to Rome with my husband, Ptolemy XIV. We were granted the status of Friends of the Republic, reaffirming Egypt's position as a client kingdom of Rome and confirming my role as Queen of Egypt. During my stay in Rome, I resided as a guest in Caesar's villa outside the city and hosted various guests, including the prominent Senator Cicero, who later described me as arrogant. It is unclear whether I remained in Rome continuously during the following years, as Caesar campaigned in Spain against the remaining supporters of Pompey the Great. However, by the spring of 44 BCE, I was certainly in Rome. Caesar had been appointed dictator for life around February of 44 BCE, but as I entered the Senate chamber on the 15th of March, known as the Ides of March, a group of senators surrounded him. After a brief struggle, they stabbed him to death. Mark Antony, who was Caesar's trusted ally, had learned of the plot the night before, but was delayed in coming to his aid. Upon hearing the commotion from the Senate chamber, he fled in fear of suffering the same fate as his mentor. Following the death of my beloved Caesar, I remained in Rome for several weeks, hoping that our son Caesarion would be named as his successor. However, I had to flee the country when it became clear that Caesar had designated his great-nephew Octavian, a 19-year-old, as his heir. This put me and my son in danger under the new regime. Octavian later took the name Gaius Julius Caesar, but is referred to by historians of that time as Octavian, to avoid confusion with his late great-uncle. I returned to Egypt, and a few months later had my husband and brother Ptolemy Exiv poisoned, leading to their deaths. The reasons behind this act remain unclear, but it is possible that my brother had begun to question my decisions. I then elevated my son, Caesarion, to the position of joint monarch, making him Ptolemy XV. With this move, I effectively eliminated anyone who could pose a threat to my rule in Egypt. However, with Caesar no longer alive, I would eventually have to align myself with one of the claimants who emerged to fill the power vacuum in Roman politics. Since Julius Caesar's assassination, his killers, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, had fled Rome and established a power base in the Eastern Empire, spanning from Greece to Syria. Octavian and Mark Antony led an army to Greece and defeated Caesar's assassins and their followers in the two battles of Philippi in October of 42 BC. The Roman Republic's territories were then divided among the leading supporters of Julius Caesar. Octavian eventually gained control over the western territories, including Spain and Gaul, while Antony took charge of the eastern territories encompassing Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, and eastern North Africa. Another prominent supporter of Caesar, Marcus Lepidus, governed the western territories of North Africa around Carthage. This alliance between Caesar's followers was known as the Second Triumvirate, and the next decade would witness fierce competition among its members to dominate the Roman Republic. In 41 BC, Antony summoned me to a meeting at his base in Anatolia, present-day Turkey. During this encounter, I convinced him to have my rebellious sister, Arsinoe IV, who had opposed me during the siege of Alexandria, executed. She had been held in exile at the Temple of Artemis near Ephesus in Greece, and, according to accounts, was forcibly removed from the temple and swiftly dispatched. This incident showcases my cunning and ruthlessness. Nearly every decision I made during my lifetime was a calculated move to consolidate my rule in Egypt and secure the survival of my dynasty through my children. One question that lingers is whether I genuinely cared for both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, or if I merely saw them as tools to gain more power. I skillfully strengthened and ultimately solidified my position as the Queen of Egypt by forming alliances and indeed through my seductive and manipulative influence over Julius Caesar. And now I set my sights on Mark Antony, recognizing him as the most powerful man in the Eastern Roman Republic. Aligning myself with him seemed necessary, as he held control over the Eastern Republic, which meant securing his support was vital in the short term. Additionally, it is worth noting that I had already met Antony before, and accounts suggest that he had been desirous of a romantic involvement with me for some years. Understanding my motivations is crucial, as my alliance with Mark Antony against Octavian would ultimately prove to be my downfall. The question arises, was my decision to engage in a relationship with Antony entirely my own choice, which ultimately backfired? Or, on the other hand, did I have no alternative given Antony's hold on power in the East and his initial strength compared to Octavian? Another aspect to consider is that my close ties with Antony resulted in the expansion of both my territory and Egypt's. Cyprus and southern Anatolia, for instance, were transferred to my jurisdiction by Antony soon after our love affair began. We can reasonably surmise that our romantic involvement commenced around 41 BC. I invited Antony to visit Egypt later that year, and he accepted the invitation. During his visit, Antony and his commanders experienced the opulent and luxurious lifestyle for which the Ptolemaic dynasty was renowned. In 40 BC, Antony departed Egypt to lead a military campaign in Syria against Parthia. During his absence, I gave birth to our twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the following year. Meanwhile, in Rome, Antony's legal wife, Fulvia, stirred resistance against Octavian's ascent to power, ultimately leading a revolt alongside Antony's brother Antonius. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, Fulvia died en route to join Antony in Greece. Subsequently, a treaty was reached between Antony and Octavian, solidifying the boundaries of their respective territories in the east and west. The uneasy peace between them was further reinforced when Antony married Octavian's elder sister, Octavia, with whom he had 2 children. However, Antony would eventually reject and divorce Octavia to be with me. After his death, Octavia took care of our children. Antony and I reunited in 37 BC when he summoned me, along with our children, to Antioch to aid him in his preparations for war against Parthia. During our time together, Antony expanded my domains in the east, encompassing regions in present-day Lebanon, parts of Palestine, territories in Arabia, as well as Crete and portions of Libya. However, Octavian capitalized on Antony's substantial territorial concessions to me, using it as propaganda to gradually rally senatorial and public opinion against his rivals. In 36 BC, Antony led his forces in an invasion of Parthia, while I returned to Alexandria, where I gave birth to our second son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Soon after, News reached me that Antony's campaign had ended in disaster, prompting my journey back to Antioch to support him. Antony and I travelled to Alexandria, where he met his second son for the first time. Our next plan involved launching another campaign in the east, specifically targeting Armenia, who had betrayed Antony during his initial campaign against Parthia by abandoning him. Octavia, Antony's lawful wife, arrived in Greece with 2,000 troops to support him. However, Antony, urging her not to venture further east, soon divorced her in 32 BC. This action was used against him by Octavian in Rome, who sought to portray Octavia as a wronged woman. In 35 BC, Octavian tightened his grip on the western half of the Roman Republic when his forces and allies defeated Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey the Great and the last remaining opponent of Caesar's heirs. Octavian received assistance in Sicily from Marcus Lepidus, the third member of the Second Triumvirate, who had occupied the region through Carthage. After the fall of Sicily, Lepidus demanded that Octavian relinquish control of Spain and Gaul to him. However, Lepidus's army shamefully defected to Octavian, leading to Lepidus losing all his positions and lands in North Africa, which now fell under Octavian's authority. This development meant that Octavian had become the ruler of the entire Western Republic. Meanwhile, Antony, reinforced by his troops, marched into Armenia and captured its royal family. He then returned to Alexandria and held a triumphant parade, showcasing the spoils of his enemies to me. This victory filled both Antony and me with confidence, and intoxicated by our triumphs, we bestowed titles and land upon our infant children, aiming to establish a dynastic empire. Notably, I proclaimed my son Azarian as the true heir to Julius Caesar, an act that made conflict with Octavian inevitable. We wrote to the Roman Senate seeking approval for our actions, which became known as the Donations of Alexandria. Octavian attempted to use this as propaganda, but the Senate suppressed it. Nevertheless, our excessive displays of wealth and disregard for Roman territory and authority effectively set the stage for the final confrontation. Tensions escalated between the East and West, with each side accusing the other of deceit and intrigue. Octavian claimed that Antony was under my spell and accused him of marrying me while still being married to Octavia, both of which to some extent were true. On the other hand, Antony accused Octavian of unjustly stripping Lepidus of his lands and position in North Africa. Both sides began military preparations against each other in 32 to 31 BC. While Antony and I gathered ships and troops in Greece, Octavian mustered his own forces, obtaining the Senate's support against Antony. The Senate stripped Antony of the consulship, and war was declared on me, with the expectation that Antony would fight by my side. Antony had relocated his fleet to the Ambracian Gulf in late 32 BC, a sizable inlet on the southwestern coast of Greece. At the entrance, guarded by the small town of Actium, Octavian's forces, led by the brilliant Admiral Marcus Agrippa, also harassed Antony's armies on land in Greece. Consequently, after several months, both Antony and I found ourselves trapped in or near the Ambracian Gulf by Octavian's fleet and land forces. It was then that I suggested to Antony that we break out and return to Egypt to regroup. He seemed to accept my advice, and on September 2, 31 BCE, a fleet departed from the Ambracian Gulf and engaged Octavian's fleet. The battle raged on throughout the afternoon, and Antony appeared to have the upper hand. His larger ships, filled with troops and ballistae, proved challenging to board due to their height advantage, allowing them to rain down fire upon the smaller enemy vessel. However, it was during this crucial moment that I, with my personal fleet positioned in the rear, broke through the centre of the battle and set sail straight towards the open sea. Witnessing my escape, Antony, too, realised that I was fleeing and followed suit. Consequently, the rest of his fleet, seeing their commanders in full retreat, lost morale and surrendered to Octavian. The Battle of Actium essentially determined the outcome of the conflict between Antony and Octavian, as well as the fate of the Roman Republic and our own destinies. In essence, this battle altered the course of European and world history, with Octavian emerging as the supreme leader of the Roman Republic, and later becoming the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Whether I lost my nerve and fled the battle, or whether escape had been planned from the beginning, remains unclear. It is worth noting, however, that the majority of the fleet I left behind with Antony appeared unaware of the plan. Therefore, it is likely that I did indeed run from the battle, or at the very least the plan was known only to Antony and myself. Regrettably, we may never know the truth. After our return to Egypt, Antony attempted to raise more troops against Octavian, but was unsuccessful. It became painfully clear to him that he had been definitively defeated, and he withdrew into a life of seclusion, and excessive indulgence, drowning his sorrows in alcohol while lamenting his lost fortunes. In contrast, I devoted my time to securing the safety of my children and made plans to send my son Caesarion into hiding. Unfortunately, my negotiations with Octavian to secure my children's lands in exchange for abdicating the Egyptian throne failed. To protect my loved ones, my closest servants, advisors, and I sought refuge in the pre-constructed tomb. From there, I sent word to Antony that I had taken my own life. As the last queen of Egypt, I had my lover embalmed and laid to rest in the tomb with the permission of our Roman captors, who now occupied all of Alexandria. By that time, Octavian had arrived in Egypt and summoned me to appear before him. Though weakened, I made every effort to maintain my dignity and appearance before my enemies. I declared that I would not be taken back to Rome to be paraded in a triumph before its mob. Octavian gave me his word that I would not be killed, but made no promises about returning to Rome. So we parted ways, each going our separate paths. According to popular belief, I had a poisonous snake, an asp, brought before me, which then bit me. However, there are accounts that state I consumed poison or injected it into my arm. Regardless of the method, my cause of death was poisoning. Despite Octavian's outrage at my suicide, he granted me the final honour of being buried in my tomb alongside Mark Antony. To this day, the exact location of the tomb and the resting place of Antony and myself remains unknown, waiting to be discovered despite various excavations and searches in modern Alexandria. Following my death, my children were sent back to Rome under the care of Octavian's sister, Octavia. However, according to accounts, Caesarion, my son, was assassinated in Egypt on Octavian's orders. This marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the failure of everything I had worked so hard to achieve in my life. Octavian himself was proclaimed the first emperor of the Roman Empire in 27 BC, taking on the name Augustus, meaning revered. Throughout his reign, he proved to be one of Rome's most effective and capable emperors. Cleopatra remains a prominent figure today, recognized as one of the most famous women in history. While many modern perceptions of me may be inaccurate, it is undeniable that I was an extraordinary woman who sought to seize control of my own destiny rather than bowing to the dictates of my family. Through my relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, I captivated and seduced two of the world's most influential men, and I nearly established a new romantic Egyptian empire. It is evident that I possessed great intelligence, ruthlessness, and cunning. Such qualities were necessary to survive in the political landscape of the 1st century BCE. However, in the end, both Mark Antony and I underestimated the capabilities and intelligence of Julius Caesar's great-nephew, Octavian. Our own errors and miscalculations, combined with his astuteness, sealed our fate. Regardless of one's opinion about my actions and motivations, it is indisputable that few people today, almost 2,000 years after my death, are unaware of the name Cleopatra. One could argue that even in death I achieved what I had always desired, lasting immortality. Thank you for your attention.